17 families fled this ranch, calling it cursed. One old couple walked in and whispered, "It's not grief, it's love." Subscribe to Wild Sky Stories' new emotional tales every day. The year was 1887, and the sun was setting over the dusty plains of Mesquite Ridge, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. A weathered wooden sign swung gently in the evening breeze, its faded letters barely visible after years of neglect. For sale. That sign had been there for 3 long years. Eleanor Hart sat on the porch of the general store, watching as yet another family climbed back into their wagon and rode away from the old Harrison ranch. She shook her head slowly, her gray hair catching the last rays of sunlight. "Another one turned it down," she said quietly to her husband Walter, who sat beside her whittling a small wooden horse. Walter looked up, his weathered hands pausing their work. "That makes 17 families now. Nobody wants that place." The Harrison Ranch had been abandoned ever since old Samuel Harrison passed away without any heirs. The property sat on 200 acres of good land with a solid house and a working well. By all accounts, it should have sold immediately, but there was something about that ranch that made people uneasy. Some said it was cursed. Others claimed they felt a profound sadness the moment they stepped onto the property. Practical folks blamed the isolation and the amount of work needed to restore it. Whatever the reason, every potential buyer who visited the ranch left with the same expression on their face. They looked haunted. The town of Mesquite Ridge was small, barely more than a cluster of buildings along a dusty main street. Everyone knew everyone, and everyone knew the story of the Harrison Ranch. Samuel Harrison had lived there alone for 40 years after his young wife passed away during their first winter on the frontier. He never remarried. He rarely came to town. And when he finally passed, he left behind a house filled with memories no one could quite explain. 2 weeks after the 17th family rejected the property, a stagecoach arrived carrying 2 passengers no one expected. George and Margaret Wheeler stepped off that coach with nothing but 2 worn suitcases and the clothes on their backs. He was 73 years old, tall despite his stooped shoulders, with kind eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled. She was 69, small and graceful, with silver hair pinned beneath a simple bonnet. They walked slowly, leaning on each other for support, and made their way directly to the land office. Thomas Brennan, the land agent, looked up from his desk as the bell above his door jingled. He studied the elderly couple with barely concealed skepticism. "Can I help you folks?" George removed his hat respectfully. "We read about a ranch for sale in this area, the Harrison property." Thomas felt his eyebrows rise. "The Harrison Ranch? You came all the way here to look at that place?" Margaret smiled gently. "We did. We read the advertisement in a newspaper back in Missouri. Something about it spoke to us." Thomas leaned back in his chair. He had given this speech many times before. "I should be honest with you folks. That property has been on the market for 3 years. Everyone who visits it decides against buying. There is something about the place that does not sit right with people." George and Margaret exchanged a look that Thomas could not quite interpret. Some unspoken communication passed between them in that brief glance. "We would still like to see it," George said quietly. "If you would be kind enough to show us the way." Thomas shrugged. He was not going to argue with paying customers, even if he knew they would be disappointed. "I can take you out there first thing tomorrow morning. You can stay at the boarding house tonight. Mrs. Patterson runs a clean establishment." That evening, George and Margaret sat together on the small bed in their rented room. The window was open, letting in the cool evening air and the distant sounds of the town settling in for the night. "Are you certain about this?" George asked, taking his wife's hand in his own. Margaret squeezed his fingers. "We agreed. After everything we have been through, we deserve peace. We deserve a place to call our own before the end." George nodded slowly. Their lives had not been easy. They had buried 2 children to fever. They had lost their farm in Missouri to a flood that swept away 30 years of work in a single night. They had spent the last 5 years moving from town to town, living with distant relatives, working small jobs just to survive. Now, with their savings nearly depleted, and their bodies growing weaker with each passing year, they had seen the advertisement for the Harrison Ranch. It was priced low, almost suspiciously so. But to George and Margaret, it felt like an answer to prayers they had stopped voicing long ago. The next morning, Thomas Brennan drove them out to the property in a small buggy. The road wound through golden grasslands and clusters of oak trees, eventually climbing a gentle rise that overlooked a wide valley. And there it was. The Harrison Ranch spread out before them like a painting, a solid log house with a wraparound porch, a barn that needed some repair but stood sturdy against the morning sky, fields that had gone wild with native grasses and wildflowers, a creek that glittered like silver ribbon along the eastern edge of the property. Thomas pulled the buggy to a stop and waited for the usual reaction, the discomfort, the unease, the muttered excuses. Instead, Margaret gasped softly and pressed her hand to her heart. "Oh, George," she whispered. "Look at it." George was silent for a long moment, his eyes scanning the property with an expression Thomas had never seen on any visitor before. It was not fear or discomfort. It was recognition. "It feels like home," George said finally. "It feels exactly like home." Thomas climbed down from the buggy and helped the elderly couple descend. He led them up the overgrown path to the front porch, producing a key from his pocket. "I should warn you," he said as he unlocked the door. "Nobody has lived here for 6 years. There is dust and cobwebs and probably some mice. The previous owner was a bit of a hermit." He pushed open the door and they stepped inside. The interior was dim, shafts of light cutting through gaps in the curtains. Dust motes floated in the still air. Furniture sat draped in white sheets like sleeping ghosts. The walls were lined with shelves filled with books and trinkets collected over a lifetime. And everywhere there were photographs and paintings of a woman. She was young in some images, middle-aged in others, but always the same woman. Dark hair, kind eyes, a gentle smile that seemed to radiate warmth even through faded photographs. Thomas cleared his throat uncomfortably. That was his wife, Elizabeth. She passed away young and he never got over it. Some folks say that is why this place feels strange. Too much grief soaked into the walls. Margaret walked slowly through the room, her fingers trailing over dusty surfaces. She paused before a large portrait that hung above the fireplace. Elizabeth Harrison looked down at her with gentle eyes. "He loved her very much," Margaret said softly. "You can feel it." George came to stand beside his wife. Together they looked up at the portrait of a woman they had never known. "That is not a curse," George said quietly. "That is devotion. That is a love so strong it became part of the very foundation of this house." Thomas frowned. "Most folks find it unsettling." Margaret turned to face him with a gentle smile. "Most folks have never loved someone so completely that losing them would break the world in half." Something in her voice made Thomas look more carefully at the elderly couple. He saw the way they stood together, always touching in some small way, shoulders pressed together, fingers intertwined. Two people who had learned to lean on each other through storms he could not imagine. "We lost 2 children," George said, as if reading Thomas's thoughts. "Scarlet fever took our boy when he was 7. Our girl passed at 14. We lost our farm. We lost everything we built over 30 years." Margaret squeezed his hand. "But we never lost each other. And we learned that love does not disappear just because the person you love is gone. It stays. It becomes part of you." Thomas felt something shift in his chest. He had sold property for 15 years, and he had never heard anyone speak about the Harrison Ranch this way. "You understand this place," he said slowly. "Most people run from it." George nodded. "We have spent our whole lives running. We ran from grief. We ran from memory. We ran from the places where we had been happy because being there without our children was too painful. He looked around the dusty room with its shrine to lost love. Samuel Harrison did not run, George continued. He stayed. He held on to every memory, every photograph, every moment he had shared with his wife. And when he passed, all of that love was left behind. Margaret walked to the window and pulled back the curtains. Sunlight flooded into the room, illuminating dust and shadows alike. "This house is not haunted by grief," she said. "It is waiting for someone who understands. Someone who will honor what came before while building something new." Thomas was silent for a long moment. Then he cleared his throat and looked down at his boots. "The asking price is $400, he said. "But I have the authority to negotiate." George and Margaret looked at each other. That unspoken communication passed between them again. Years of shared experience and understanding condensed into a single glance. "We will take it," George said, "at the full asking price." Thomas looked up sharply. "You do not want to negotiate? Property has been on the market for 3 years. Margaret smiled. "This place is worth far more than money. We would not feel right paying less." 1 week later, George and Margaret Wheeler officially became the owners of the Harrison Ranch. The town of Mesquite Ridge watched with curiosity as the elderly couple began the slow work of restoration. George could not work as fast as a younger man, and Margaret tired easily, but they worked together with a rhythm that spoke of decades of partnership. Neighbors began to notice small changes. The overgrown path was cleared. The porch was swept. Windows that had been dark for 6 years began to glow with lamplight in the evenings. Eleanor Hart was the first to visit. She arrived one afternoon with a basket of fresh bread and preserves, uncertain what she would find. What she discovered took her breath away. The house had been transformed, not with expensive furniture or fancy decorations, but with care. The dust was gone. The curtains had been washed and rehung. Fresh wildflowers sat in vases on every table, and Elizabeth Harrison's portrait still hung above the fireplace. But now it was surrounded by other photographs. George and Margaret's wedding portrait, pictures of their children, faded images of parents and grandparents and friends long past. Margaret welcomed Eleanor with tea and fresh biscuits. They sat on the porch together, looking out over the valley as the afternoon sun warmed their faces. "You kept her pictures up," Eleanor observed. "Elizabeth's?" Margaret nodded. "Of course. This was her home. Her love is part of these walls. We are not replacing what was here, we are adding to it." Eleanor fell. Tears pricked at her eyes. All those other families who came to look at this place. They said it felt wrong somehow. "Sad," Margaret considered this carefully. "Sadness is not always wrong. Sometimes it is the echo of something beautiful that once existed. This house remembers love. It remembers devotion. Those are not things to run from." She looked at Eleanor with gentle understanding. "We have learned that you cannot outrun grief. It follows you wherever you go. The only way forward is to make peace with it, to carry it with you and let it become part of something new." Word spread through Mesquite Ridge about the Wheeler couple and how they had transformed the Harrison Ranch. People who had avoided the property for years found themselves curious enough to visit. What they found surprised them. George and Margaret had created a home filled with warmth and welcome. They hosted Sunday dinners for anyone who wanted to attend. They opened their barn for community gatherings. They tended a garden that produced enough vegetables to share with half the town. But more than that, they brought something to Mesquite Ridge that had been missing for years. They brought hope. Young couples who visited the ranch came away with a new understanding of what marriage could be. They saw George bring Margaret her shawl before she even asked for it. They saw Margaret set out George's reading glasses before he sat down with his book. They witnessed 1,000 small acts of love refined over 50 years of marriage. "How do you do it?" young Sarah Mitchell asked one evening. "How do you stay so in love after all this time?" George and Margaret looked at each other with that familiar our glance. "Love is not something you find and keep forever without effort," George said. "It is something you build. Every day, every choice. You decide to love this person, and then you keep deciding. Margaret added, "We have had terrible days. We have argued and disagreed and wanted to give up. But we made a promise to each other when we were young, and every morning we choose to honor that promise again." The seasons changed. Summer faded into autumn, and autumn into winter. George and Margaret's health declined slowly but noticeably. They moved more carefully now. They tired more easily. The town rallied around them. Walter Hart came every week to help with repairs. Eleanor brought food and stayed to help with the heavier cleaning. Young men from neighboring ranches took turns chopping wood and mending fences. And in return, George and Margaret gave them something precious. They gave them their stories. On cold winter evenings, neighbors would gather in the Wheeler parlor to listen. George and Margaret took turns speaking, their memories weaving together like threads in a tapestry. They spoke of the early days of their marriage, when they had nothing but each other and a dream. They spoke of raising children and losing them. They spoke of heartbreak and recovery, of faith tested and faith renewed. And always, they spoke of love. Not the passionate love of youth, though they had known that too, but the deeper love that comes from walking through fire together. The love that holds your hand when you bury your child. The love that rebuilds after floods and failures. The love that forgives and forgets and starts again. Spring arrived with wildflowers and bird song. George's cough had worsened over the winter, and everyone knew what that meant. Margaret never left his side. They sat together on the porch, wrapped in blankets, watching the valley come alive with new growth. His hand rested in hers, thin and fragile now, but still warm. "Are you afraid?" Margaret asked one golden afternoon. George was quiet for a long moment, not of dying, only of leaving you. Tears slipped down Margaret's cheeks. "I will not be far behind, my love. We both know that." He squeezed her hand. "Then I will wait for you, just like Samuel waited for Elizabeth, just like love always waits." George Wheeler passed peacefully 3 weeks later with Margaret beside him and half the town keeping vigil outside. They buried him in the small cemetery behind the ranch, in a plot he had chosen himself. The whole town attended, and the service lasted for hours as person after person stood to share what George had meant to them. Margaret stayed at the ranch for another 8 months. She grew weaker, but her spirit remained bright. She continued to welcome visitors, to share her stories, to spread the love that had defined her entire life. On the last morning, she asked Eleanor to help her sit by the window overlooking the valley. The autumn sun was warm, and the trees were dressed in gold. "It was a good life," Margaret said softly. "Not an easy one, but a good one." Eleanor wiped her tears. "You changed this town, you know. Both of you did." Margaret smiled. "We just showed people what they already knew but had forgotten. Love is the only thing that matters in the end. Everything else fades away." She closed her eyes. "George is waiting for me. I can feel it." Margaret Wheeler passed that afternoon, her hand resting on the windowsill, her face peaceful in the autumn light. They buried her beside George, just as she had asked. The headstones stood side by side, simple and beautiful, inscribed with the same words, "Together at last. Together forever." The Harrison Ranch, now known as the Wheeler Place, never returned to its former loneliness. Young families took over the property, generation after generation, each one adding their own photographs to the walls alongside those who came before. Elizabeth Harrison, Samuel Harrison, George Wheeler, Margaret Wheeler, and all the others who found love within those walls. The house that everyone had refused to buy became the most beloved home in Mesquite Ridge. Not because of the land or the views or the solid construction, but because of what it held: love, memory, hope, and the enduring truth that some connections transcend time itself. Visitors still come to the Wheeler Place today. They sit on the porch and watch the sunset. They read the inscriptions on the headstones in the family cemetery. They feel something in the air that is hard to describe but impossible to deny.